He lost an envelope full of cash expecting the worst, but four homeless kids returned it without taking a cent. What started as a simple act of honesty became a turning point in a billionaire's life, a moment that reminded him of everything money could never buy: trust, love, and purpose. Before we begin, leave a comment below and let us know where you are watching from so we can say hello. Now let's get into the story. Jonathan R. Hayes was 41 years old and worth over $4 billion. To the outside world, he was the untouchable CEO of Hayes Global Holdings, a name etched across the skyline of Manhattan in gold. His life appeared flawless: tailored suits, a corner office that overlooked the city, and a calendar filled with deals, dinners, and press conferences. But beneath the sharp suits and steel smell was a man whose wealth had become his armor and his prison. Raised in privilege, Jonathan had never known hunger or cold. Yet somehow he had always felt hollow. His days were filled with numbers, meetings, and acquisitions, but his nights were spent in silence, staring out from a penthouse too large for one man. He had no family, his parents had passed, and he'd pushed everyone else away in pursuit of an empire. Relationships, they came and went, always ending with the same line: "You care more about money than people." He used to scoff at that. People left, money didn't. That was his mantra. Until the morning his envelope went missing. That envelope, stuffed with cash for an urgent off-the-books acquisition, wasn't just valuable. It represented control, order, and when he realized it had vanished, something inside him cracked. For the first time in years, he felt vulnerable and furious. He stormed back through every alley he'd walked, retraced every step. No luck. That morning, Jonathan Hayes didn't just lose money, he lost the illusion that he had everything. What he didn't know was that four small children, strangers in every way, were about to give him something money never could. The wind cut through the narrow alley like a knife, carrying the scent of yeast and burnt coffee from the bakery nearby. The sun had barely risen, casting a dull gray light across the damp pavement. It was the kind of morning that made even the most well-dressed New Yorkers clutch their coats tighter. But for Caleb, Mason, Ethan, and Luca, there were no coats to clutch, just worn-out layers, frayed at the seams and damp from the night's rain. Caleb, the oldest at 12, walked ahead with a quiet sense of duty. His shoes had holes in the soles, but he stepped with purpose, scanning the alley for anything useful: recyclables, half-eaten food, maybe something warm. His dark hair hung over his forehead, soaked from the mist. Behind him, 9-year-old Mason kept a close eye on Ethan, who was only 7 and prone to wandering off when distracted. Ethan clutched a cracked plastic cup, hoping for another nickel's worth of deposit if they could find a matching bottle. He didn't complain, but his fingers were red from the cold. And then there was Luca, 6 years old, the only girl with tangled blonde hair and eyes far too tired for her age. She gripped Caleb's hand like it was the only thing tethering her to the earth. Her little legs struggled to keep up, and her oversized jacket, probably once a donation, barely shielded her from the chill. She hadn't spoken much since the night they were forced to leave the shelter. She just followed Caleb and leaned into his side when the wind got too sharp. They passed piles of flattened cardboard and empty crates. A stray cat darted out of a milk crate and startled Mason, who let out a short yelp before catching himself. Caleb turned his head quickly. "Stay close," he said, his voice calm but firm. They weren't out here for fun. Breakfast hadn't come in days, and last night's dinner had been a bruised banana someone had tossed from a passing car. Still, they kept moving. This alley behind the bakery had saved them once before a discarded sandwich still wrapped. That morning, they hoped for a similar miracle. The alley behind the bakery had become familiar territory, not safe, never truly safe, but familiar. Its walls were streaked with old graffiti and oil stains, of the pavement littered with scraps from dumpsters and forgotten deliveries. For nearly a month, this maze of back streets had been the closest thing Caleb, Mason, Ethan, and Luca had to a routine. Home wasn't a place anymore. It was wherever they could stay warm and out of sight. Mason crouched near a rusted bin, his eyes scanning with practiced precision. He spotted something wedged behind a milk crate, half a bagel, stale and slightly hard, but still edible. He reached for it quickly, his stomach aching with anticipation. Found something he called softly over his shoulder, not loud enough to draw attention, but just enough for his siblings to hear. Ethan, ever hopeful despite the circumstances, poked at a discarded cup left on the ground, its rim stained pink. He tipped it slightly and watched as a few sticky drops of what used to be fruit juice trickled out. He licked his lips instinctively. then looked up at Mason and shrugged. Nothing left, he muttered, disappointed but not surprised. Caleb remained alert as he hovered nearby, one eye on the street's opening, in case anyone approached the other, watching his siblings. "Don't eat it yet," he said to Mason. "We'll split it later." Mason hesitated but nodded, placing the bagel in the worn canvas tote slung over his shoulder, a bag that once carried school books, now burdened with cans, crumpled bottles, and the hope of a few coins at the recycling center. Luca, the youngest, sat on a broken wooden pallet, rubbing her hands together. Her small fingers were red and raw, her eyes wide as she watched her brother's work. She didn't complain, she rarely did, but her silence always said more than words could. She was tired. They all were. A garbage truck rumbled by in the distance, its metallic groan echoing through the alley. The scent of garbage mixed with rain-soaked cardboard filled the air. No one flinched. They'd grown used to it. Ethan wandered toward a stack of crates, kicking at a plastic wrapper as he passed. "Think we'll find anything good today?" he asked no one in particular. Caleb didn't answer. He was too focused, too tense. Every morning was a gamble. Some days brought nothing but bruised fruit and disappointment. Other days, something unexpected. Luca had been quiet for most of the morning. Her small hand remained buried in Caleb's. Her steps slower now, her body trembling slightly with each cold gust of wind. She hadn't spoken since the boys had split the stale bagel and tucked it away. But as they passed the green dumpster at the far end of the alley, something caught her attention. She froze. Her eyes dull with exhaustion just moments ago now, focused sharply on a white shape nestled against the wet concrete, too clean, too sharp-edged, to belong here among the grime and crushed soda cans. Luca tugged on Caleb's sleeve, her voice barely a whisper. "Caleb, look." He followed her gaze and immediately spotted it, a pristine white envelope, its edges crisp and unwrinkled despite the damp pavement. A golden wax seal gleamed faintly under the morning light, untouched, immaculate, like it had fallen from another world and landed here by mistake. Caleb stepped forward cautiously, his brows drawing together. Mason and Ethan leaned in behind him, suddenly forgetting their hunger and weariness. "What is that doing here?" Mason murmured, his tone filled with suspicion. Kneeling slowly, Caleb picked it up. It felt heavy in his hands, too heavy for just paper. He turned it over, inspecting the seal. His fingers trembled slightly. "It's sealed tight," he muttered, "like something important." Ethan, curious as ever, crept closer. "It's not even dirty," he said, crouching beside him. "Who would drop something like this?" And not notice, Mason added, "It could be just old mail. Maybe someone threw it away." But Caleb didn't believe that. He peeled the flap open with trembling fingers, careful not to tear the fine envelope. A faint scent of cologne and leather drifted up, an oddly elegant smell for a back alley. Inside, his eyes locked on what seemed unreal, a thick stack of crisp $100 bills. Band after band, neatly wrapped, not a single bill creased. His breath caught in his throat. He slowly pulled the bundle out, the weight of it pulling at his hand and at something deeper in his chest. Mason leaned over his shoulder, his mouth slightly open. "Oh man," he whispered, his voice full of awe. "That's gotta be, I don't even know how much. Thousands." Ethan's eyes sparkled for a moment, wide with hunger and hope. "We could buy warm food every day. No more stale bagels. No more waiting behind bakeries." His words floated into the morning air like a spell. Caleb didn't answer. His heart was pounding. He could feel the responsibility heavy in his chest, like each bill added another pound of pressure. He looked up at his brothers, then at Luca. Her blonde hair tangled, cheeks pale from cold fingers curled into her sleeves. Mason bit his lip. "Maybe it's a sign, Caleb. Maybe it's for us. I mean, who drops this much money and doesn't come back for it?" Caleb didn't reply. He just kept staring at the cash, torn between instinct and integrity. Then Luca's small voice broke the moment. "It's not ours," she said simply. Everyone turned to look at her. She wasn't loud. She didn't cry or beg. She just stood there with her oversized jacket and big solemn eyes, as if her 6-year-old heart already understood something far too adult. Ethan looked at her uncertain. "But we need it with full meals and a warm, clean place to stay for a few months, at least through this cold season." Luca stepped forward and gently touched Caleb's arm. "Do you think someone could use it to heal or save a loved one?" Caleb looked at her with heavy eyes. Luca continued. "We don't deserve it," she said. "And Mom always said, if it's not yours, don't touch it, no matter how shiny it is." Her voice shook a little at the word mom, but she stood straight. Caleb swallowed. He thought of his mother. She had kept them warm with almost nothing. She had told him over and over again that poverty was never an excuse for dishonesty. He looked down at the money again. The wind picked up, brushing against their ragged clothes. It would have been so easy. Just take it. No one saw. No one would know. But they would. Caleb took a deep breath and closed the envelope carefully. "We're going to find out who this belongs to," he said at last. No one argued, not because they didn't want the money, but because in that moment they knew keeping it would cost something far more precious: their mother's faith and their own. Caleb crouched beside an overturned crate and carefully slid the thick envelope open a second time, not for the money, but for anything that might reveal where it came from. His fingers moved with the same caution a thief might use, but not out of guilt. It was fear, fear of doing something wrong, even while trying to do what was right. Inside, between two stacks of crisp bills, something thin caught his attention. A small white rectangle. He tugged it free. "A business card," he muttered. The others crowded in around him. Mason leaned over his shoulder while Ethan tried to see from behind, standing on the tips of his toes. The card was sleek and clean, the corners sharp, the letters embossed in deep navy ink. Caleb read it aloud. Jonathan R. Hayes, Hayes Global Holdings. The name hit the air like a bolt of lightning. Mason blinked. "Wait, I know that name. Isn't he on the news sometimes?" Caleb turned the card over. The back had an office address downtown and a phone number that looked far too official to be fake. "This guy, he's not just rich," Caleb said slowly. "He's someone really important." Ethan's eyes widened. Like suit and private jet, important, like he could buy this whole block and not blink. Mason added. Caleb traced his thumb across the initials stamped on the envelope's flap. J.R.H. The golden wax seal had the same monogram. It matched the name on the card perfectly. This was no random lost wallet. This envelope belonged to a man who probably didn't even know what it was like to miss a meal. Luca looked up at Caleb. "Are we still giving it back?" she asked softly. He hesitated. Just for a moment, they could vanish with the envelope and never be found. The man was probably too busy to even notice it was gone. But then he met Luca's eyes, wishy, tired, honest. "Yes," he said simply. "We are." Mason ran a hand through his messy hair. "Well, if we're going to return it, we better not look like we're stealing it." Ethan frowned. "We already do." That got a weak laugh out of Mason, but Caleb didn't smile. He was staring at the address on the card. Hayes Global Holdings, Midtown Manhattan, towering glass buildings and security guards. It might as well have been a world away. "How far is that?" Luca asked. Caleb squinted at the card again. "About an hour, maybe more." "Walking?" Mason asked. "Yeah," Caleb said. No one said anything else. They just looked at each other, four kids with tired eyes and aching stomachs holding the kind of money that could change their lives, and choosing instead to follow a name printed in gold foil. Jonathan R. Hayes. Whoever he was about to meet four kids with more integrity than most of the adults in his world. The streets of New York were already alive with noise and movement as the four children stepped out of the alley and into the morning rush. Car horns blared, steam rose from subway grates, and business people with briefcases swept past without a glance. Caleb held the envelope close to his chest beneath his coat, his arms crossed tightly, not just to hide it, but to protect it from everything the cold, the crowds, and even his own second thoughts. He led the way, head down, navigating like he'd done so many times before, but never for something this important. His legs ached from days of sleeping on concrete, and his stomach twisted with hunger. But he didn't slow. Neither did Mason, though he limped slightly from a sore ankle likely twisted the day before while hopping a subway grate. Ethan trailed behind, dragging his feet at times, kicking small stones across the sidewalk. But he didn't complain. He kept glancing up at the tall buildings as they got closer to the heart of the city, the concrete giants making him feel even smaller than usual. Little Luca, smallest of them all, clutched Caleb's hand with one of hers and held onto the sleeve of Mason's jacket with the other. Her tiny legs struggled to match their pace, and her breath came in short puffs visible in the cold morning air. But she said nothing. She simply walked. 1 block turned into 5, 5 into 20. The envelope was heavier now, not physically, but in their minds. They were carrying something valuable through a world that had never given them anything for free. Caleb checked the card again when they paused at a traffic light. Hayes Global Holdings, he murmured. Across the street, the tower rose into the sky glass steel and mirrors, shimmering in the morning light. Its entrance gleamed like something out of a movie, a place where no one would ever expect four dirty, hungry children to walk through the doors. Luca looked up at it, her voice barely audible. It looks like a castle. Caleb gave her hand a gentle squeeze. Let's hope the king is home. They stepped onto the crosswalk. No one questioned what they were doing, not even once. The journey had taken over an hour, their feet sore and cold, their throats dry. But they didn't turn around. They had made a decision, and no pain, no fear, no hunger would stop them now. This wasn't just about returning an envelope anymore. It was about proving perhaps to the world, but more importantly to themselves, that even in the shadows of the richest towers, four kids with nothing could still do the right thing. The glass tower loomed above them like a monument to a different world, one filled with warmth, power, and things they had never known. Its mirrored facade reflected the city around it, but not them. They didn't belong here, and they felt it instantly. As Caleb pushed open the heavy revolving door, a rush of warm, perfumed air swept over them. Inside, the lobby gleamed with polished marble floors, towering columns, and cascading chandeliers. A massive front desk stretched across the far wall, behind which stood two security guards dressed in sharp navy blue uniforms. The children hesitated as the door closed behind them. They didn't look like they belonged, and everyone knew it. Heads turned. A receptionist froze mid-sentence. The click of heels stopped short. Whispers rose like smoke in the pristine air. Mason instinctively stepped in front of Luca, shielding her. Ethan shrank beside Caleb, suddenly aware of how dirty his sleeves were, how exposed his bare feet felt against the cold marble. One of the security guards approached quickly, eyes narrow. "You kids can't be in here," he said firmly, already motioning toward the door. "This is private property. We're not here to cause trouble." Caleb said, his voice steady but soft. He reached into his coat and pulled out the envelope with both hands, careful to show it wasn't a weapon. We found this. We think it belongs to Mr. Hayes." The guard paused, eyes flicking to the gold seal on the envelope, then to the business card Caleb had placed on top of it. His expression shifted just slightly, but his stance remained rigid. "This isn't a place for lost and found," the guard muttered. "How do you even know what's inside?" "We didn't take anything," Mason said quickly. "It was like that when we found it." The other guard joined in, now curious. He took the envelope and examined it, eyebrows lifting at the initials and the crispness of the seal. He held up the business card and murmured something under his breath. Luca peeked out from behind Mason, clutching his jacket tighter. Her voice was barely a whisper. "We just wanted to give it back." That sentence hung in the air longer than expected. The first guard exchanged a look with his partner. After a long pause, he reached for the phone behind the desk. "Wait here," he said, softer now. "Don't touch anything." The children didn't move. They stood huddled together under the blinding lights, the polished world around them, too clean, too cold, too far from anything they understood. And yet, for the first time, someone was listening. High above the city, on the 48th floor of Hayes Global Tower, Jonathan R. Hayes paced the length of his office, frustration simmering beneath his otherwise composed exterior. His floor-to-ceiling windows offered a sweeping view of Manhattan, but today he barely noticed the skyline. His thoughts were consumed by one mistake, one envelope. The morning had started like any other black coffee, quick headlines, and a brisk walk near Central Park to clear his mind before his first meeting. But somewhere between adjusting his coat and answering a call, the envelope had slipped from his inside pocket. He hadn't noticed until hours later, when it was too late. It wasn't just money inside, it was trust. It was the cash for a confidential deal set to close by the end of the day, an acquisition too sensitive to wire, too important to delay. And now it was gone. Hayes rubbed the back of his neck, jaw clenched. For a man who controlled empires, losing track of anything, especially something that important, was unthinkable. He turned to his desk and tapped his phone, impatiently dialing his assistant for the 5th time. Before the call connected, there was a knock at the door. "Come in," he said, his voice sharp. Elena, his assistant, stepped in. Her face bore an expression he hadn't seen in years. Hesitation, doubt. "Sir," she said softly, "there are 4 children downstairs." The security guard said, "They found an envelope with your name on it in the back of a trash can. They walked all the way here to return it." Children Hayes blinked, unsure if he had heard correctly. You mean 4 street kids picked up my stuff, she nodded. They said it was yours. They took good care of it and returned it. Hayes fell silent, feeling the weight of it, not just what it contained, but what it meant. He had thought of betrayal, theft, a lesson in carelessness. Instead, he was faced with something much rarer, integrity. Give them to me, he whispered. Then for the first time in years, the billionaire sat down, his hands slightly unsteady, and waited to meet the children who had done what few adults ever would. The elevator doors slid open with a soft chime, revealing the executive floor, a world of quiet opulence. Every surface gleamed, from the marble floors to the crystal chandelier hanging like a frozen waterfall above their heads. The air smelled of polished wood and expensive cologne, a far cry from the damp, gritty streets they'd walked to get here. Caleb stepped out first, his breath catching slightly in his throat. Mason followed close behind, trying not to track dirt on the floor. Ethan held tightly to Caleb's sleeve, his wide eyes scanning the massive paintings on the walls. Luca clung to Mason's side, her fingers barely peeking out of the sleeves of her too-big coat. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. The silent, echoing hallway said enough. You don't belong here. A tall woman in a gray suit gestured them forward. She didn't smile, but she didn't look angry either. Just surprise. She led them into a large corner office that looked more like a throne room than a workspace. Floor-to-ceiling windows revealed the whole city below. A massive desk stood at the far end, and behind it, Jonathan R. Hayes rose slowly to his feet. He didn't say a word at first. His eyes landed on them mud-splattered shoes, clothes threadbare from too many cold nights, cheeks sunken and pale. Children no older than 12 standing in a place few billionaires would ever imagine them entering. Then his gaze dropped to the envelope in Caleb's trembling hands. You found this? Hayes asked, his voice low and even. Caleb swallowed hard. Yes, sir. You opened it? Yes, Caleb replied again. Only to see if there was a name. We didn't take anything. Hayes stepped out from behind his desk and approached them, each step echoing in the stillness. The closer he got, the more the children instinctively pressed together. Luca tightened her grip on Mason's coat. Ethan shifted behind Caleb, but Caleb stood tall even as his hands shook. Hayes stopped in front of them. His eyes rested on the envelope, then back on Caleb. You could have kept it, he said. No one would have known. Caleb nodded. We would have known. The silence that followed was thick, charged with something none of the kids had a name for, but Hayes did. Honor. His throat tightened. He had dealt with kings, senators, tycoons, but never had anyone returned something so valuable without asking for anything in return. And certainly not 4 hungry children from the back streets of Brooklyn. He glanced down at Luca, who looked up at him with quiet, steady eyes. Her cheeks were red from windburn, and her shoes were soaked through. She looked so small, so breakable, but she hadn't run. None of them had, and that's when it hit him. These weren't just poor kids. They were heroes. 4 small, quiet, trembling heroes who had every reason to choose differently, but didn't. The air in the office seemed to still thick with tension and something else, something almost sacred. No one spoke. The 4 children stood close together beneath the glittering chandelier and the sweeping view of the city skyline, their ragged silhouettes casting long shadows across the marble floor. Jonathan Hayes reached out and took the envelope from Caleb's hands. His fingers brushed against the boy's, a quick, accidental contact, but it left a strange sensation behind. The boy's hands were cold, thin, and trembling. Hayes didn't speak. Not yet. He turned and walked slowly back to his desk, each footstep echoing louder than it should. The office, usually a sanctuary of power and precision, now felt like a stage, and Hayes, for the first time in a long while, wasn't sure what role he was supposed to play. He lowered himself into the chair behind his desk and laid the envelope in front of him. The golden wax seal had been carefully opened and resealed with respect. Not torn, not crumpled. That alone told him more than words ever could. With deliberate calm, he pulled out the wad of bills, stared at it, and looked up at the kids. They didn't move. Luca clung to Mason's arm, her small body pressed tightly against his. Ethan looked down at the floor, shifting his weight from one bare foot to the other. Caleb kept his gaze straight ahead, steady as if daring himself not to look away. Hayes's expression didn't change. He took a slow, shallow breath. You didn't take $1, he asked, finally breaking the silence. His voice wasn't accusatory. It was soft, disbelieving. It shook slightly as if the ground beneath him had shifted in some subtle but lasting way. Caleb shook his head. No, sir. If you're not sure, you can check again. Caleb's voice was firmer. Hayes looked at him. Why not? Caleb hesitated. The question wasn't simple. Not really. He looked at Luca, then at Mason and Ethan. His voice was low, almost embarrassed by his honesty. Because it's not ours, he said. And because our mother, she always said it was important to do the right thing, even when no one was watching. Luca nodded slightly. Even when we're hungry, she added. Hayes felt something tighten in his chest. He leaned back his hands on the smooth surface of the table. He looked away just for a second, as if trying to swallow something that had come up too quickly, too unexpectedly. These were just kids. And yet, they had done something most adults wouldn't. No hesitation, no attempt at reward, just integrity offered like it was normal. You came all the way here, on foot, he asked. Mason answered this time. We walked from Brooklyn. It took a while. Hayes was quiet again. His jaw tightened, and his gaze dropped to Luca's shoes, if they could even be called that. The soles were almost detached. Her socks, mismatched and soaked, peeked out through cracks in the canvas. She looked cold. All of them did. He swallowed hard. In his world, people lied over a few cents. They backstabbed over contracts. They sued over misunderstandings. Yet here were 4 kids who had every reason to take that envelope, who needed it far more than he did, and they didn't. It broke something in him. Or maybe it rebuilt something that had been broken for a long time. Most people would have taken it, Hayes said, finally, his voice rougher now, and they would have had excuses. You didn't. Ethan spoke up, quiet but clear. We wanted to. We were really hungry. Luca nodded solemnly. But Ethan continued. Caleb said that if we did, it wouldn't feel right, and it wouldn't make Mom proud. Hayes leaned forward, elbows resting on the edge of his desk, and stared at them with something like awe. He remembered being 10 years old and watching his father yell at a man for losing a briefcase full of company checks. He remembered how ruthless the world had felt. He'd promised himself back then that money would protect him, that if he had enough, he wouldn't need people. Now standing in front of him were 4 people who had none of it, and yet seemed stronger than anyone he knew. He stood slowly, walking back around the desk toward them. He knelt down to Luca's level, resting one hand gently on his knee. She looked up at him, blinking through messy strands of blonde hair. What's your name? He asked. Luca, she whispered. Hayes nodded. He turned to look at Caleb. Are you the oldest? Yes, sir, Caleb replied. And they're your siblings? Caleb nodded. Mason is 9, Ethan is 7, and Luca is 6. He nodded again, taking it all in. Their names, their faces, their stories. I don't know what to say, he muttered, except, thank you. Luca smiled slightly. You're welcome. And in that moment, Jonathan Hayes, billionaire mogul titan of glass towers, felt something shift inside him. Not because of what he lost, but because of what he had just been given. He moved around them and returned to his desk, the envelope still resting on top. His office was full of things that projected power: awards, certificates, photos with presidents framed stock market charts. But right now it all felt hollow. The truest thing in the room was what 4 hungry children had carried through the cold. As he sat, he gestured to the armchairs across from his desk. Would you like to sit down? The children hesitated. Mason looked at Caleb. Caleb gave a small nod. It was a silent reassurance. It's okay. We can trust him. Luca climbed into the nearest chair, her legs not quite reaching the floor. Ethan followed, curling up beside her. Mason leaned back slowly, as if unsure whether the soft leather was real. Caleb sat last, straight-backed and alert. Hayes leaned forward, folding his hands. You've reminded me of something I think I lost a long time ago, he said. Honor. And that doing the right thing doesn't have to come with cameras or applause. Caleb didn't answer, but his eyes softened. I want to help, Hayes continued. Not as a reward, but because I can. Because I should. Ethan looked up, his brows furrowing. You mean like, give us food? Hayes smiled gently. Yes, food. A warm place to stay. And maybe more, if you'll let me. The room went quiet again. This time it wasn't filled with tension, but something cautious. Hope. Caleb cleared his throat. We don't want charity, sir. I know, Hayes said, but this isn't charity. It's gratitude. It's respect. Luca leaned her head against Mason's shoulder. "We're just tired," she whispered. "And hungry." Hayes nodded slowly. "Then let's start there." The moment he saw how hollow their eyes were, how their fingers trembled, not just from nerves but from exhaustion and cold, something inside him shifted like a door swinging open after years sealed shut. He canceled 2 afternoon meetings, told his executive assistant to reschedule a board call, and instructed the kitchen staff to prepare something immediately. Something hot, something comforting, something a child would remember not because of luxury, but because it tasted like safety. And then he did something he had never done before. He opened his private dining room to 4 strangers, children ragged and weathered by a world that should have protected him but didn't. The long oak table gleamed beneath the warm chandelier light. A fire crackled in the built-in hearth along the wall, casting a soft orange glow over everything. The windows framed a sweeping view of Midtown Manhattan, but none of the kids cared about the skyline. Their eyes were locked on what was being brought out in steaming trays, bowls of creamy chicken noodle soup, fresh turkey sandwiches stacked with lettuce and cheese, warm apple slices sprinkled with cinnamon, and mugs of hot chocolate with melted marshmallows floating on top. Caleb held back at first, unsure. So did Mason. They weren't used to being invited in. Even when help had been offered in the past, it had strings or pity. This felt different. It felt sincere. Hayes pulled out a chair for Luca himself, and she hesitated before climbing in. Her feet dangled above the floor. She wrapped her hands around the mug of cocoa before even touching the food, the warmth causing her lips to quiver. Mason sat beside her, his gaze darting around the room as if this might all vanish any second. "Is this for real?" he whispered under his breath to Ethan, who only nodded slowly, mouth already full of sandwich. Caleb remained standing until Hayes gestured toward the empty seat at the head of the table. "This one's yours," he said kindly. "You brought that envelope all the way here. Sit like the leader you are." Caleb hesitated, then finally lowered himself into the chair. The warmth of the room soaked into his skin. For the first time in weeks, his guard lowered just a little. They ate slowly at first, uncertain, like someone might come take it all away. But with each bite, the stiffness in their bodies seemed to ease. Every spoonful of soup washed away a layer of fear. Every sip of cocoa replaced some piece of broken trust. Luca giggled softly as she found a mini marshmallow stuck to her spoon. Hayes smiled. He hadn't heard a child laugh in years, not one that hadn't been rehearsed or performed in a charity video. This one was real. And for a man who lived in a world of polished presentations and carefully curated appearances, the sound of genuine laughter felt like music. Mason went back for seconds. Caleb tried to protest, but Hayes waved it off. "Let him eat," he said with a warm chuckle. "We can make more. I haven't had soup like this since—" Mason paused. "Since Mom." That silenced the room, but not in a sad way. Ethan looked up from his plate. "She made the best grilled cheese." Luca nodded. "And she used cinnamon like this on our apples." Hayes' chest tightened. He could picture her, this invisible woman who had taught her kids to be honest, even when the world gave them every reason not to be. A woman who must have gone without so they could eat, who must have sewn together their coats at night and told them stories to make the dark seem less scary. "She raised you right," Hayes said softly. Caleb looked up at him. "We try to make her proud." "You did." Hayes replied, voice thick. The fire crackled. Outside, the city kept buzzing and spinning, unaware of what was unfolding in this quiet room high above the chaos. A billionaire sat at the end of a table once reserved for high-powered executives and celebrity donors, now sharing a meal with 4 kids who had returned what most people would have taken, and it was the most meaningful table he had ever sat at. As they finished, Hayes stood and poured himself a glass of water. He turned back to them, leaning gently against the sideboard. "You know," he said, voice calm but strong, "money can build buildings. It can win awards. But it can't buy what you gave me today." They looked at him, unsure what he meant. "You reminded me that there's still good in this world," he continued, "and that sometimes it comes from the most unexpected places." Luca yawned quietly, eyes blinking slowly now, full belly making her drowsy. The plates on the long table were mostly empty now, but no one was in a rush to leave. The air inside the private dining room was warm and still, the fire casting a soft golden glow that flickered across the children's tired faces. Hayes leaned slightly in his chair, watching them not like an investor eyeing a proposal, but like a man genuinely seeing something or someone for the first time in a very long time. Luca had fallen asleep in her chair, her chin tucked to her chest, a smear of chocolate still at the corner of her lips. Mason had draped his coat gently over her shoulders. Ethan sat curled up beside her, sipping what was left of his cocoa, now lukewarm, but he didn't seem to mind. And Caleb, ever alert, remained upright and quiet, scanning the room from time to time, not with suspicion, but with a cautious kind of responsibility. It was Caleb who finally broke the silence, his voice low but steady. "Our dad died 4 years ago," he said, without being asked. Hayes looked at him and nodded slowly, saying nothing, yet just listening. "He was a janitor at a school in Queens," Caleb continued. "Worked the night shift. He used to come home after we were already asleep, but he never complained." "Not once." Mason's eyes shifted toward Caleb. Ethan stopped sipping. "One night he didn't come home," Caleb said. "We waited all morning, then the phone rang." He swallowed. There'd been an accident. Some pipes had burst. He slipped on the floor, hit his head. They said it was fast, that he didn't suffer. Caleb looked down at his hands clenched tightly in his lap. He was the one who made things feel safe, even when we didn't have much. There was a pause, a long one. Hayes leaned forward slightly, elbows resting on the table. "And your mother?" he asked gently. Caleb's jaw tightened. "After Dad died, she took 2 jobs. Waitressing during the day, cleaning houses at night. She was barely home, but when she was, she'd make us sit in a circle, all 4 of us, and talk about our day just so we'd remember we were still a family." He gave a soft, humorless smile. She'd always fall asleep in the chair. But she never missed those little talks. Mason added, his voice barely more than a whisper. "She used to tell us bedtime stories, even when her feet were bleeding." Ethan nodded, blinking fast. "She made pancakes out of nothing. Said they were wish cakes." Hayes's throat tightened. She started coughing. Caleb said, his voice hardening now, as if recounting it was scraping something raw. "Just a little at first, but it got worse. The kind of cough that keeps you up at night. She'd say it was just the dust from cleaning." Mason looked away. "She was sick," Caleb continued. "Really sick, but she couldn't stop working. There was no one else. We didn't have insurance. Every dollar she earned went toward rent and food and keeping us together." Hayes clenched his fingers into a fist under the table. "She collapsed one night after coming home," Caleb said. In the middle of telling Luca a story, Ethan buried his face in his knees. "She tried to hide it from us," Caleb said, "but we knew. And by the time she finally went to the hospital, it was too late. Pneumonia, and the doctor said it had been building for months. If she'd gotten care sooner..." His voice cracked and he didn't finish the sentence. "She died 3 weeks later," Mason said flatly, "in a charity hospital room, alone, because they wouldn't let us stay." Silence pressed down like a weight. Caleb looked up again, eyes glassy but unyielding. "We tried to stay in the apartment. I did my best, but I was only 12. The landlord changed the locks the second rent was late. We had no family, no one came for us." Hayes's eyes narrowed, not in anger at them, but at a system that had allowed this to happen. "They said there'd be a social worker," Caleb added, "but no one showed up. We were just forgotten." "How long have you been on your own?" Hayes asked, voice barely audible. "Almost 11 months, Caleb replied. "Shelters here and there. Sometimes friends would let us stay a night. Sometimes we stayed on trains. We've been through places most people pretend don't exist. And you've been looking after them." "All this time," Caleb nodded. "I couldn't let them be separated. That's what they said would happen if we went to the authorities. They'd split us up, put us in different homes." Luca stirred gently in her sleep, as if sensing the shift in the air. Hayes rubbed a hand over his jaw, the room swimming slightly with emotion. He'd spent decades protecting assets, guarding interests while chasing margins. He'd thought he'd seen the worst of what the world could do to people. He was wrong. "Do you blame her?" Hayes asked softly. Caleb frowned. "Blame who, your mother? For hiding how sick she was?" Caleb was silent for a long moment. "No," he said finally. "She was trying to protect us. She thought if she stopped working, we'd fall apart. So she gave everything she had, every hour, every breath." He looked Hayes in the eye. "She died trying to keep us together. That's not something I'll ever blame her for." Hayes stood walking to the window, eyes fixed on the skyline. The cars below looked like toys. His buildings felt colder than ever. He had built an empire, yes, but at what cost? What had he truly protected? What had he missed? He turned back to them, to the quiet children sitting at his table, a silent girl sleeping beside a mug of cocoa, three boys who had somehow carried the world on their backs and still found the strength to do the right thing. Caleb, he said after a long silence, you didn't just protect your family. You've done something most grown men would never have the courage to do. You didn't fold. You didn't run. You held on even when the world gave you nothing. Caleb didn't speak, but his chin lifted slightly, shoulders straightening. Hayes' continued, voice thick with something unfamiliar, reverence. You're not just surviving, you're leading. That kind of strength, it's not taught in boardrooms. It's forged in the fire. Mason wiped his eyes. Ethan leaned into his brother, resting his head on Caleb's shoulder. Hayes looked at each of them. You don't need to fight alone anymore. And this time no one said a word. But in the silence, something passed between them, something deeper than contracts or signatures. It was trust, and maybe, just maybe, it was the start of something none of them had ever truly known. Belonging. The plates had been cleared, and the scent of cinnamon and warm chocolate still lingered in the air. Hayes's private dining room was now hushed, lit only by the flickering fireplace and the soft golden chandelier overhead. The fire popped occasionally, but it was the only sound in the room as the four children sat quietly, too full to move, too unsure of what would happen next. Luca had finally stirred awake. She rubbed her eyes sleepily, still nestled in Mason's coat. A soft pink glow from dessert remained on her cheeks. Mason was watching the fire, hands folded in his lap, while Ethan fidgeted with the handle of his cocoa mug. Caleb, ever watchful, sat upright, alert as always, even after everything they'd been through that day. Jonathan Hayes hadn't spoken for several minutes. He was staring at the table, deep in thought, a subtle storm brewing behind his calm blue eyes. And then, without warning, he leaned forward, slightly resting his forearms on the table, and looked straight at them. Not with pity, but with something far more powerful, respect. I've been sitting here trying to find the right words, he began, his voice low and even. But I'm just going to say it. Four pairs of eyes turned toward him. I don't just want to say thank you, Hayes continued. I want to help, not with a one-time donation, not with a few nights in a hotel or a check to get you through the week. He paused, and Caleb narrowed his eyes slightly, unsure of where this was going. Hayes's gaze settled on him first. Caleb, I know you've been taking care of them on your own. I know what that's cost you, what you've had to give up, but you shouldn't have to keep doing it alone. Caleb opened his mouth to speak, but nothing came out. Hayes shifted his eyes to the others, Ethan, who was now sitting up straighter, Mason, whose lips parted slightly in shock, and little Luca, who blinked slowly as though still unsure if this was real. I know I'm a stranger to you, Hayes said, softening his tone, but I want to offer you something more permanent. The room went still. Would you let me take care of you? He asked. Not just today, not just this week. I'm asking if you would consider letting me become your guardian. Silence. Not the awkward kind, but the kind that fills a space so completely it feels like time itself has paused. Ethan looked up at Caleb, confused. Mason furrowed his brows. Guardian Hayes nodded. I want to give you a home. Real beds. School. Food that doesn't come from a trash bin. I want to make sure you never have to worry again about where you'll sleep or how you'll eat. I can't bring your parents back, but I can promise you that you'll never be alone again. Caleb stood abruptly, pushing back his chair. His eyes were wide, not angry, but overwhelmed. Why, he asked, voice barely above a whisper. Why would you do that for us? Hayes looked up at him without flinching. Because you reminded me what it means to be decent, to have character. You brought something back to me that I lost a long time ago. You saved more than my envelope, Caleb. You saved a piece of me I didn't know was missing. Caleb's chest rose and fell rapidly. You don't even know us. Hayes stood slowly, mirroring Caleb's posture but not pressing closer. That's true, but I know what you've done. I know who you've shown yourselves to be without anyone watching, without any reward. He looked at each of them again. And I know this world doesn't make it easy to stay kind, to stay honest, but you did. That's enough for me. Ethan reached for Mason's hand under the table. Luca rubbed at her nose, not quite understanding everything but sensing the importance in the air. I don't want to take your parents' place, Hayes added. No one ever could. but I can give you a safe place to grieve, to heal, to grow. You deserve that. Caleb's lip trembled, but he clenched his jaw. What if the system doesn't let us stay together? I've already made calls, Hayes said gently. I can apply for emergency guardianship. I've got the legal team and the influence to make sure you stay with each other. Caleb sank back into his chair, eyes filling with something dangerous and fragile hope. Mason cleared his throat. You'd really want us, all of us? Hayes stepped around the table and knelt beside Luca, who was now staring at him with wide, blinking eyes. He reached out slow and deliberate and brushed a strand of hair from her face. All of you, he said softly, exactly the way you are. Tears welled in Luca's eyes and she leaned forward, wrapping her arms around his neck. She didn't speak, but her grip spoke for her. Hayes closed his eyes for a second, holding her gently. Ethan stood up. Can we have a dog? He asked cautiously. Hayes smiled. A big one. Name him together. Mason let out a soft laugh. And books. Can we have books again? As many as you want. All eyes turned to Caleb now. His were brimming, his voice raw. We've never asked anyone for anything. I know, Hayes said. And you don't have to start now. I'm offering. No strings, no conditions, just a place to finally exhale. Caleb stared at him for a long moment. Then finally he nodded. Hayes didn't cheer. He didn't celebrate. He just reached across the table and shook Caleb's hand. A billionaire and a 12-year-old boy. Two strangers. One promise. And just like that, something extraordinary began, not because someone gave money, but because someone gave themselves. It wasn't just a home being offered. It was family. The city glowed under a blanket of twilight as Jonathan Hayes pulled the sleek black SUV into the private entrance of the Midtown Hotel. The hustle of Manhattan had dimmed with the fading sun, and soft golden lights flickered on inside buildings that loomed high above the quiet street. For most of the day, the children had walked. For most of their lives, they had wandered. But tonight, Burmain, they were being driven somewhere warm, somewhere safe by a man who only hours earlier had been a stranger. Caleb sat in the front passenger seat, his shoulders stiff, but his hands resting on his lap, no longer clenched into fists. Behind him, Mason had his head leaning against the window, tracing foggy shapes on the glass as the car rumbled gently forward. Ethan had long since curled up beside Luca, whose head lay on her brother's chest, rising and falling softly with each breath she took. In her arms, she clutched something new, something she'd chosen from the hotel gift shop. With timid fingers and wide, disbelieving eyes, a fluffy white teddy bear nearly her size, with a soft pink ribbon around its neck. Hayes parked in the underground garage and turned off the engine. The silence in the vehicle was gentle, peaceful. For the first time in a long while, no one was in a rush. No one was cold. No one was waiting for the sky to clear or the rain to stop before they could sleep. We're here, Hayes said quietly, not wanting to disturb the calm too much. Caleb nodded, glancing back to check on his siblings. They're okay, he murmured. Just tired. Hayes led them through a private elevator, straight to a suite he had personally arranged far from the noise of the street high above the city. When the doors opened, the children hesitated. It wasn't fear, it was disbelief. The suite was warm and glowing with soft lights in every corner, plush couches, thick carpet beneath their feet, and a fireplace flickering quietly behind glass. Two adjoining bedrooms branched off the main space. In one, 4 neatly made beds weighted with folded pajamas, soft blankets, and fresh towels. In the other, a larger bed and another bathroom, should they want to stay close together. A tray of cookies sat on the coffee table, beside bottles of water, and a small card that read, "Welcome home for however long you choose to stay." Mason stood frozen, his eyes wide as he took it all in. Ethan let out a breath. "We don't have to sleep on the floor." "No," Hayes said gently, placing a hand on his shoulder. "Not anymore." Luca walked to one of the beds slowly, almost like she was afraid it would disappear. She touched the sheets, then the pillow, then finally climbed in, pulling the covers up to her chin and clutching the teddy bear tight to her chest. Her eyes fluttered, then closed. She was asleep within minutes. Mason dropped his shoes near the door and walked barefoot across the carpet, laughing softly. "It feels like walking on clouds." Caleb didn't speak. He just stood near the window, staring out over the city as the lights twinkled below. His hands were in his pockets, his chin lowered slightly. Hayes stepped beside him. "She's safe," Hayes said, nodding toward Luca. "I know," Caleb whispered. You all are. Caleb didn't respond right away. He just kept staring at the skyline at the city that had taken so much, and now, in this small but profound moment, had given something back. Hayes gently handed him a folded bundle, new pajamas, navy blue soft cotton. There's a bathroom just down the hall. There's toothpaste, soap, everything. Caleb nodded and finally turned toward the hallway. He showered with the door locked, the hot water running down his back like something sacred. He stood there longer than he should have, his fingers gripping the edge of the counter afterward as he stared into a mirror so clean it almost startled him. When he returned, the room was quiet. Mason was asleep across one bed, snoring gently. Ethan lay curled in another, his arms tucked beneath his head, a peaceful expression on his face. And Luca, she hadn't moved. The bear was still in her arms, her lashes resting gently against her cheeks. Caleb climbed into the final bed. For a long time he didn't sleep. His body ached, but not from cold. His chest tightened, but not from fear. He stared at the ceiling, the dim light of the city peeking in through the curtains. And then finally it hit him. Tears welled up slowly at first, then faster, falling freely down his cheeks, across his temple, soaking into the pillow. They weren't loud. They didn't shake his body like the cries he'd held back over the years. These were quiet tears. Tears of release. Tears of relief. He cried for the nights he had stayed awake in alleyways while Luca shivered in his lap. For the days he'd stolen pieces of stale bread just to split it 3 ways. For every time he'd told Ethan that tomorrow would be better, not because he believed it, but because they needed to believe it. And now, for the first time, tomorrow might actually be better. Hayes watched from the doorway for a moment, then slowly pulled the door almost shut, leaving it cracked just enough. Enough to say, "I'm here." Enough to say, "Sleep in peace." That night, in a warm hotel suite with real sheets and no shadows, 4 siblings rested. Not as street kids, not as survivors, but as children. And for Caleb, it was the first night he let go. Not because he gave up, but because for once in his life, he didn't have to carry everything alone. The next morning, the sun broke through the Manhattan skyline. With a softness it rarely offered, golden rays warming the high-rise windows of the suite where 4 children were still peacefully sleeping. But for Jonathan Hayes, the day had begun hours earlier. He sat at his desk in his private study, coffee, untouched, a folder of documents open before him, and his lawyer seated across the table reading carefully. "Are you certain you want to go through with this, Mr. Hayes?" the attorney asked, eyebrows raised. "This is not typical. I've never cared much for typical," Hayes replied, his voice calm but unwavering. He tapped his pen against the folder. Inside were affidavits, emergency petitions, and signed declarations. Within just 24 hours of that dinner, after that quiet night in the hotel suite, Hayes had mobilized every legal connection he had. His personal assistant, Elena, had spent the evening calling caseworkers, shelter directors, and even reaching out to the overburdened child welfare office. But it was Hayes who made the final call, who put his reputation, his name, and his entire company's media arm on notice. No press, no leaks. This isn't for headlines, this was personal. By the 3rd day the whispers had started, a billionaire taking in 4 homeless children. Lawyers and executives asked questions, some curious, some suspicious. Had Hayes lost a bet? Was this part of a PR stunt? Was he compensating for guilt? But none of that mattered. What mattered were the names etched into the paperwork, now being fast-tracked through family court. Caleb Bennett, Mason Bennett, Ethan Bennett, and Luca Bennett. 4 children who had fallen through the cracks. 4 children who had changed everything. At the emergency hearing later that week, Hayes arrived alone. No photographers, no security detail. Just a man in a gray suit and quiet determination in his eyes. The children waited with Elena in a separate room nearby, coloring books in hand, unaware of the paperwork being signed just down the hall that could change their lives forever. The judge, a seasoned woman in her 60s with silver hair and eyes that missed nothing, reviewed the case with sharp focus. "Mr. Hayes," she said, adjusting her glasses, "let me be frank. You are a public figure, a businessman, a billionaire. What draws you to legal guardianship of 4 homeless siblings?" Hayes looked directly at her. "They didn't ask for anything. They didn't take what wasn't theirs. They reminded me of who I used to be before the boardrooms, before the walls I built around myself. They reminded me of what I lost chasing things that never mattered." The judge studied him in silence. "Do you understand the responsibility you're taking on? This is not a sponsorship. This is not charity. This is parenting through trauma, through fear, through healing. I know, Hayes replied softly. And I'm not here to play the hero. I'm here because I believe I was meant to find them. Or maybe they were meant to find me. There was a pause. The room seemed to hold its breath. Then the judge nodded slowly. Emergency guardianship is approved. Full review to follow within 90 days. Until then, Mr. Hayes, you are responsible for the care, safety, and well-being of these 4 children. The sound of the gavel striking the bench echoed like thunder in Hayes' ears. It was done. He rose, thanked the judge quietly, and left the courtroom. Outside, Elena was waiting with the kids. Caleb was pacing slightly. Mason leaned against the wall. Ethan sat on the floor, tapping his sneaker, and Luca was dozing on a bench with her bear in her lap. They looked up as he approached. Well, Mason asked, voice rising with cautious hope. Hayes knelt down so he was eye level with all of them. He looked at Caleb first. It's official, he said. You're not going back out there. Not ever again. Caleb blinked rapidly. Mason exhaled loudly. Ethan grinned, and then, as if unsure if he should, threw his arms around Hayes' neck. Luca woke up and rubbed her eyes. Are we staying with you? Hayes nodded. If you want to. She didn't say anything. She just hugged his arm and didn't let go. Over the next few days, the transition began gently, deliberately. The penthouse was slowly transformed from a cold bachelor retreat to something that looked and felt like a home. The kitchen was stocked with cereal and peanut butter. A playroom was designed where an office used to be. A dog, a big floppy golden retriever named Rocket, joined the household and instantly claimed Luca's lap as his throne. But more importantly, the children were not just surviving. They were living. Ethan enrolled in 2nd grade and proudly brought home a spelling test with a perfect score. Mason discovered a love for drawing and filled sketch pads with stories of rockets and forests and castles. Luca found her way to music, humming softly to the tune of lullabies long forgotten. And Caleb, though still guarded, began to smile. Not the forced one, not the cautious one. A real unguarded smile. Especially when Hayes let him design a small library for their apartment and asked him earnestly, what books do you want in there first? The headlines eventually leaked, of course. They always did. But Hayes refused interviews, declined offers for documentaries, and turned down every photo op. The world didn't need to know everything. But he did answer one question in a quiet statement sent through his legal office. People ask me why I took in 4 children with nothing to their name. My answer is simple. Because they reminded me of everything I'd forgotten to value. And because they showed me that family isn't blood or status. Sometimes it's 4 kids standing in your office with dirty shoes and unshakable hearts. And you realize they were never lost. You were, Shiro. And with that, the world finally left them alone. And inside that Manhattan home, built not of marble or glass, but now of trust and healing, 1 man and 4 children built something richer than any fortune Hayes had ever known. A family. The glossy cover of Metropolitan Life magazine caught the world's attention, a candid photo of Jonathan Hayes laughing, really laughing, with 4 children clinging to him in a park. The caption beneath the image read, "The envelope that changed a billionaire." His suit jacket was rumpled. One of Mason's crayon drawings peeked from his inside pocket. Luca had her arms around his neck. Her blonde hair caught mid-motion, and Ethan and Mason each clutched a soccer ball. Caleb stood just behind Hayes with a calm but unmistakable smile on his face. There was no posing, no publicist, staging, just a moment of unfiltered joy. The story quickly went viral. Billionaire takes in homeless kids. Some called it a redemption arc. Others suspected a PR ploy. But those who had witnessed it firsthand, school teachers, social workers, neighbors, even Hayes' longtime assistant Elena, knew better. Because the real transformation didn't come from headlines. It came from healing. Months earlier, Jonathan Hayes had been a man of marble and steel, known for mergers and boardroom dominance. His world had been precise, controlled, untouchable. But all of that began to unravel with one envelope, lost by chance, returned by grace. That envelope, once filled with currency, had instead become a vessel for something far more valuable: truth, compassion, humanity. Hayes never forgot that moment in his office, standing face to face with 4 street-worn children who had every reason to walk away with his money but didn't. In their silence, their honesty, their hunger, and their choice, he saw himself. Or rather, he saw who he had once been before the wealth, before the power, before he built walls so high that even he could no longer see over them. Now those walls were gone. His penthouse was no longer quiet. Luca had a habit of humming her own songs in the hallway every morning. Rocket, the golden retriever they had adopted, barked when Ethan dropped cereal on the floor. Mason often stayed up late working on comic books at the kitchen counter, inventing superheroes that somehow always looked like Caleb. And Caleb, though still quiet and protective, had begun to exhale. He'd even joined Hayes on early morning runs, where they talked less about business and more about life. Jonathan Hayes hadn't expected to find family. He hadn't planned to become a father figure, but now every time he walked through the front door and was greeted with four voices calling, "Hey, Mr. Hayes," or "You're home," or "Can we order pizza?" he felt something real, something alive, not a deal, a connection. He kept the envelope too, the original one. It sat in a frame above his desk, not for the money which was long gone, but for what it had come to represent. Beneath it was a brass plaque inscribed with just three words: "They chose honor." He would sometimes stare at it during long days, especially when the business world threatened to pull him back into its soulless current. But then Luca would come skipping in, holding a drawing of their forever home, or Mason would ask if they could build a tree house in the country house they now visited on weekends. Ethan might crawl into his lap after a hard day and fall asleep mid-sentence. And Caleb Wise, wounded brave Caleb, would watch it all, still standing guard in his quiet, steady way, making sure this second chance held. Hayes never tried to be their replacement parent. He didn't pretend to fill the void their mother and father left, but he gave them space to remember and grieve, and more importantly, he gave them a future. He was there for parent-teacher nights, for school plays, for sick days, and every bedtime that they let him be. And slowly they let him be. And in return, they gave him something that couldn't be bought. Luca was the first to call him Dad in a whisper as she handed him her kindergarten art project, a stick figure family with 5 smiling faces. Hayes had paused, overcome, unsure if he had heard her right, but the moment was real. So he smiled and said, "That's me," and she nodded, hugging his leg. Later, Caleb told him, "You don't have to be perfect, just stay." And Hayes did. The magazine article came and went. Donations poured into shelters across the city. People cried reading the story, inspired by the rare glimpse of kindness and choice. But for Hayes, it was never about redemption or applause. He had all the money in the world. But what he hadn't had until now was peace. One night, months after the adoption papers were finalized and the noise of the world quieted, Hayes sat alone in the den with the framed envelope in his lap. He ran a finger across the seal. He remembered how angry he'd been when he thought it was lost, how scared. Not because of what the envelope contained, but because losing it had made him feel powerless. It wasn't the money that mattered anymore. It was the kids who had found it and refused to be changed by it. That was the real wealth. He set the frame back on the shelf just as Mason barreled into the room holding a sketch pad. "Can you look at this? I gave Rocket a superhero mask." Hayes chuckled. "Only if I can be in the next issue." Mason grinned. "You already are. You're the guy who saves the hero." Hayes froze for just a second, then smiled, because somehow that felt exactly right. That envelope had once been filled with $10,000. Now it held a story, and a heart, one that had been buried under years of success and solitude, finally unmistakably reclaimed. We'd love to hear what you think. Drop a comment below and rate this story from 10 to 100. Tell us where you're watching from too. Make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a story. And if this touched your heart, check out more uplifting videos by clicking on the end screen. Now,